Thank you, Jerry. Obviously, I'm the academic, the one not wearing the sports coat. But I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here. I was in Warsaw about 15 years ago. My, how things have changed here, which makes this the perfect backdrop for my talk, and also more generally for us to be discussing e-cigarettes. So, let me... Now, I've been doing modeling. I've been doing modeling for a while. I should start with the second reason for modeling, the one probably most people think of, and that's predictive. That is, you look at how well models explain past behavior, and you use that to predict future behavior. Well, back in the good old days, my models were very good, if I do say so myself. They predicted well, because there were very stable patterns. Cigarette use was, the vast majority of nicotine use was cigarettes. Policies had fairly clear-cut patterns. Life was great from a modeler standpoint. Now we've kind of moved more towards hypothetical because we're in a different world. And I'll talk about one of my hypothetical models in a minute. But finally, what I want to stress, and perhaps the greatest use of modeling now, is a way of organizing and thinking about this new world that we're currently in. Here's an example. There have been quite a few models of modified risk products and e-cigarettes, and most of them, unfortunately, have been framed in terms of prediction. Okay. Recently, I had a paper that came out in Tobacco Control, and it was purely a hypothetical. Not that all people in tobacco control viewed it that way, but it was hypothetical, is what would happen if people switched to e-cigarettes. What I did was I tried to model two scenarios. One that, in my view, was the more realistic one, the optimistic one, in which there were substantially reduced risks of e-cigarettes, and that they were something that smokers would find desirable. And another one, not to mention any names of anybody, perhaps from California, but a view that might be held by those that take a more pessimistic view of e-cigarettes. And I don't have time to go through the data here, but basically what we did was we compared the e-cigarette scenarios with the scenario, what we called the status quo scenarios, if there weren't e-cigarettes, to show the health impacts. And lo and behold, even in the pessimistic case, there were major gains associated with e-cigarette use. So moving on, prior to that paper, I had a paper that was in Nicotine and Tobacco Research, and it focused on youth initiation. And you could view it as a predictive model. I put in tentative parameters. And unfortunately, I think many people did view it that way. I'm later going to argue, when things don't predict well, you call it a heuristic model. But I think in that article I did try to say that these are very tentative estimates, and based on that, based on looking at the potential gateway effects as well as the potential substitution of e-cigarettes for smoking, we found that on balance you could expect positive net public health gains as a result of e-cigarette use. But again, I would emphasize that there was a heuristic element. And in a paper there's in Addiction, we drew out this diagram. And it's very important to look at the steps in this diagram. First, you see that the public health impacts depend on what people would have done in the absence of e-cigarettes. That's what we call a counterfactual. What would they have done? So you need to distinguish those who had the higher risks, who would go on to smoking. That's something really very difficult to do, especially in a changing world like we're now in. Secondly, what I did was I distinguished what I would call experimental use from long-term use. And that's important because there are major transitions and we need to be very mindful of those. But even going beyond that, experimental use is not something clearly defined. You know, people talk about e-cigarette use among youth. They talk about use in the last 30 days, any use at all in the last 30 days. A large portion of that use is people that use less than 5 times in the last 30 days. In my view, that's a good predictor of whether that individual has friends and has gone to parties. You know, and it's not at all clear to me that that person is somebody who has seriously experimented with e-cigarettes. Now, if you take the group of ever users who are not current users, you know, maybe these are people that lost their friends and, you know, are not feeling too good and maybe are even more prone to smoking as a result of that. I don't know. I'm being a bit facetious here. But regardless, the important point is definition of use is something that's unclear, and we need to seriously explore what's meant before we can really try to predict what's going on. Furthermore, we need to be mindful that in this rapidly changing world, there's not only effects that vary by age, but by cohort. Experience is very important. You know, people that tried a first-generation product, maybe they were turned off, but they need to be aware that the market has changed. And these can be very important in future use. Okay, I won't go through it, but the same kind of thing would apply to those who are already smokers, where we need to distinguish those who would have quit from those who haven't. Okay, so now I want to get into a new area in which I'm in. And in many ways, I consider this the most important work that I'm doing in e-cigarettes. Because in my view, many of the misconceptions, or let me restate that, many of the strong views are based on an understanding of the cigarette industry and the view that the cigarette industry will come to dominate not just heat not burn, but e-cigarettes. Okay, so this is a view that needs to be looked at much more carefully. And I think it's important to look at the market and the structure of the market to distinguish things. And I look at the market as involving 3 aspects. You know, first of all, we need to look at the final users. That's what's most important. But we need to understand that the final users, you know, who are they? What's important here? Well, we probably, when we look at the market structure, we want to focus on the device manufacturers, and that's what I argue is the relevant market in terms of understanding the industry itself. But at the same time, going back, we need to understand that device manufacturers sell through 4 different venues at least. Originally, it was through the internet. Later, it was primarily through conventional retail, then, you know, tobacconists or whatever they're called, and then vape shops. Okay, these are 3 very distinct sectors, and vape shops are very different than conventional retail. So we need to be mindful of all this. And what we need to understand, and if we look at the data, you know, we see that conventional retail, and my understanding, and I'm not saying we have good data on this. We need to be collecting much better data on how e-cigarettes are marketed. If we're going to understand these markets, this is essential. But not only a large portion is not conventional retail where traditionally e-cigarettes were sold, but the proportions in vape shops and so on is where we've seen the growth over time. Now, I've calculated, you know, assuming that most of the e-cigarettes sold by the cigarette companies is through conventional retail, I calculated market shares. And according to my estimates, at most we're talking, and this is, even using 2017 data, which is before Juul. Since Juul, reportedly in the US, Juul is about 70% of the market. The market share of cigarette companies in e-cigarettes is pretty low. And my guess is it might be below 10% now. I'd be surprised if it's more than 20%. Again, we don't have great data. This is something we need to know. But this is a far cry from the cigarette industry where there's two and a half firms, let's say, that dominate the market in the US. This is very different. And it's unlikely, in my view, to change. Why? Because there's not the kind of entry barriers that we see in cigarette markets. And in particular, one of the important entry barriers, which effectively, in a way, was created by tobacco control, advertising, direct media advertising is banned in most countries now. But retail point of sale advertising is allowed. But that's not what's important. It's the slotting allowances that come with it. And with those slotting allowances, the cigarette companies in the past have used those to buy up shelf space. Well, all of a sudden, Juul has all this shelf space. Something dramatically different has happened in the retail market. This is a really, really major change, in my view. But more fundamentally, there's not the kind of entry barriers. There's not the kind of marketing aspects and so on that we see in cigarettes. So there's much more of a potential for viable competition, and many of the people in tobacco control are afraid of competition because what they've seen is the lack of competition in the cigarette markets. Well, if we regulate the e-cigarette markets too much, maybe we might see the same thing in e-cigarettes, but that's clearly not inevitable. And I would argue that this market is one with competition, and as all the speakers before me have suggested, there is a desire for safer products. So anyway, the evidence so far, I think, is consistent with the market being competitive, but a lot in the US will depend on how e-cigarettes are regulated. Hopefully, there is the potential of competition from non-cigarette companies. I think that is important. We'll see competition from heat not burn. I don't view that as necessarily a bad thing. And competition can bring on some very important gains. Now, last topic I want to cover is how difficult it's going to be in predicting the role of policies. Because we need to look at, first off, the two separate kinds of policies. Policies directed at e-cigarettes and policies directed at cigarettes. They each they're targeting different groups, but the effects are interactive. To the extent that we have major restrictions on e-cigarettes, I would argue that the policies oriented towards cigarettes become less effective because you have less effective substitutes out there. To the extent that you have a viable e-cigarette market, there's the potential for the policies directed at cigarettes to be much more effective. And I would fully expect that they will. And I think that we've seen that in the US. We've seen some dramatic drops in cigarette use, not only among adults, but among the young. I mean, it's really quite dramatic. And I think that's because not only do we have e-cigarettes, but the cigarette-oriented policies have become much more effective. And in fact, we have a greater justification for implementing those. Before, we raised taxes Most of the people who smoke, not most, a large portion of the people that smoke are relatively low income. Is that fair? I mean, you could argue that's not fair. But if there's a viable substitute, especially one that's cheaper, not only is that fair, but that's a good thing from a public health standpoint. So anyway, we need to look at the interactions between policies, and we need to be mindful of how the policies affect the structure of the market, because ultimately that's going to be an important determinant of how the effects of e-cigarettes play out. So here are my conclusions. Basically, the idea of we need to, in my view, we should focus on modeling as a way of understanding markets. We need to start looking specifically the marketing of e-cigarette products. And when we look at government regulations, we got to expect that the effects are going to be much more complicated, and we're going to need much more complex models than we've had in the past. I'd like to finish with several of the sayings of Yogi Bear's, by the way, a U.S. baseball player, later a coach, not to be confused with Yogi Bear, the cartoon character. And I think some of the things he said are particularly appropriate at this point in time. Thank you.